Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Mr. Dinesh D'Souza. Dinesh D'Souza has a 25-year career as a writer, scholar, and public intellectual. A former policy analyst in the Reagan White House, Mr. D'Souza also served as the John M. Allen Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and as well the Robert and Karen Rishwain Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He also served as the president of the King's College in New York City from 2010 to 2012. Mr. D'Souza has received many titles over the years, including Top Young Public Policy Maker in the Country by Investors Business Daily, one of America's most influential conservative thinkers by the New York Times Magazine, and he was listed by the World Affairs Council as one of the top 500 leading authorities on international issues. Mr. D'Souza quickly became known as a major influence on public policy writings. His first book, Illiberal Education, publicized the phenomenon of political correctness in America's colleges and universities, becoming a New York Times bestseller for 15 weeks. It has been listed as one of the most influential books of the 1990s. His 1997 book, Ronald Reagan, How an Ordinary Man Became an Extraordinary Leader, was the first book to make the case for Reagan's intellectual and political importance. In 2002, D'Souza published his New York Times bestseller, What's So Great About America, which was critically acclaimed for his thoughtful patriotism. His 2003 book, Letters to a Young Conservative, has become a handbook for a new generation of young conservatives inspired by Mr. D'Souza's style and ideas. The Enemy at Home, published in 2006, stirred up a furious debate from both the left and the right. It became a national bestseller and was published in paperback in 2008 with a new afterword by the author responding to the critics. Mr. D'Souza is also an accomplished filmmaker, with him releasing the fantastic 2016 Obama's America, as well as a movie that must be seen titled America, Imagine a World Without Her. On July 15, 2016, Dinesh will be releasing his newest feature film titled Hillary's America, The Secret History of the Democratic Party, which is promising to be a must-see feature film before the November elections. One of Mr. D'Souza's favorite venues for debates and speeches has been college campuses. During the past 25 years, he has appeared at hundreds of colleges and universities, becoming a prominent YAF speaker that is always in high demand. One of Mr. D'Souza's recent events had him at the University of Michigan engaged in a YAF-sponsored intellectual debate with Bill Ayers. Mr. D'Souza has inspired me, as I hope he will inspire you to defeat and debate the left at every turn. Please join me in welcoming Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you very much. I am very pleased and very honored to be here. I have a long association with the Young Americas Foundation. I'm thrilled to have my wife, Debbie, here. We're actually newlyweds, just married for 3 months. We're actually both immigrants, me from India, Debbie from Venezuela. And it's very touching to me listening to some of you introduce yourself and then also looking into the audience. I'm reminded I was about your age when I first came to America at the age of 17 as an exchange student from Mumbai, India. I still remember the plane flying and then touching down at JFK in New York. And I looked out of the window. I kind of saw the New York skyline. I saw the Statue of Liberty. And a very strange feeling came over me because I realized in one moment that my whole life from that time on would be completely different. I felt I was moving from the margin of the world to the center. And I knew intuitively, although I didn't understand intellectually at the time, that I was coming to a country where I would be able to be, to a degree previously unimagined, the architect of my own destiny. That, to me, is one of the great blessings about living in America, is that it's a country where we are in the driver's seat of our own life. I know that there are some parents here, and sometimes your mom or dad will go, "Hey, young Billy, young Jane, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And they can advise you, but at the end of the day, it's going to be you and not they who will answer that question. I just came from Los Angeles. Yesterday I watched the final cut of our movie on Hillary. Well, it's not just on Hillary. It's on Hillary, and it's a whole history of the Democratic Party and progressivism. The Democrats used to call themselves liberals in the 1980s. One of the accomplishments of Reagan was to make the term liberal into an epithet. And as the term became too disgraceful for Democrats to hold, they decided they needed a new name, and they've come up with progressive, identifying themselves with progress. My last film 4 years ago, well, I had America in between, but my last film in a presidential year was 2016, Obama's America. Well, I must say that was a film that kind of upset the raging narcissist in the White House. And sometimes people go, "Well, gee, Dinesh, what makes you think that the President of the United States was upset at your movie?" Well, shortly after the movie came out, these vituperative attacks began to appear on the movie, unsigned, on a website called BarackObama.com. And when you read these attacks, at the time I wasn't totally sure. I thought that maybe some sort of a campaign thing. But now that we've heard all these Obama speeches, and I go back and look at those articles, it has that peculiar mixture of pomposity, indignation, and incoherence that we have unmistakably come to associate with President Obama. Well, all I can tell you is that if the last film upset Obama, this film is in a completely different category. And it takes on a much wider target. And this is actually, for me, it's been kind of eye-opening because, I've been a conservative now since my college days. And yet, in digging into this film, I've learned things that I never knew before. Let me say a word about that, by the way, because we're at a very interesting moment today in which these terms like conservative and Republican, you kind of wonder what they mean anymore. What does it mean to be a conservative now? You might say, well, it means the same thing as it meant for Reagan. Not exactly. Because remember, Reagan developed his conservatism in response to the very specific challenges of the 1970s. Stagflation. That means stagnant economy and inflation at the same time. A Soviet bear on the prowl. And so Reaganism emerged as a reaction and response to those conditions. Well, those conditions are totally gone. And we're in a different world today. So while our principles don't change, the application of them certainly does. You can't just win today politically on a kind of warmed over Reaganism. You have to reapply those principles now. But it might be worth beginning by just asking the simple question, we're conservatives, and I see two problems right away. What are we conserving? That's question number one. And question number two is, what if you happen to be a conservative on a liberal campus? Many of you are going to be heading off to college. The reigning ideology on the campus is liberal. So what do? You conserve liberalism? No. So right away you need to know, what am I conserving? And number two, how do I do it in a climate that is apparently hostile to my beliefs? The first thing I want to say about that is that I think that conservatism in America is completely different than conservatism in Europe. Traditionally, conservatism in Europe was identified with throne and altar, with the church and with the aristocracy and the monarchy. And conservatism meant conserving those institutions and almost reflexively opposing change. In America, however, we are a revolutionary country. America started with a violent revolution against the British. And while a revolution may be just, it can never be legal. America was started illegally. Now, we're conservatives. What are we conserving? We're actually conserving the principles of the American Revolution, which is to say, paradoxically, that we're actually conserving a kind of liberalism. But it's not the liberalism of today. The liberalism that we conserve is actually classical liberalism. Liberalism defined as a belief in liberty, in freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, religious freedom, freedom of thought and expression. Now, that conservatism, if you will, the conservatism of the founding, faces two powerful waves of attack. The first wave of attack is, you could call it the wave of the 1930s. And the wave of the 1930s was the emergence of a certain kind of the New Deal, the Great Society, and now all the way through Obamacare and Hillary's education proposals. It's essentially a ferocious attack on one of those prongs of freedom, mainly economic freedom. The second wave came in the 1960s, and that was more in the nature of a more sweeping attack on all the freedoms that conservatism tries to conserve. By the way, one of the differences between libertarianism and conservatism is that while conservatism is concerned about both the wave of the 30s and the wave of the 60s, libertarianism opposes itself only to the wave of the 30s. It essentially is comfortable with the revolutions of the 60s, but it tries to save economic freedom against the attack that is coming from the sort of socialist, anti-colonialist left. Now, I think that with Obama and Hillary, we have seen something quite new that we didn't have before. Before, what we had on the left was, well, at its very worst, we had massive incompetence. A classic example of it would be Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is the reigning holder of the 20th century title in presidential nincompoopery. I say this, I mean, I don't even actually mean to be here. I'm saying it with what I think is almost clinical objectivity. And the reason I say that is because with Carter, what he attempted was never what he got. He always tried to do X, and he found himself receiving Y. So, for example, he didn't like the Shah of Iran. He thought the Shah of Iran was a tyrant. He had a secret police. He was right about that. And so Jimmy Carter goes, whoa, I got to pull the Persian rug out from under him. And he does. And what does he get? Khomeini. So Carter, that you find here, is ignoring a very simple principle of foreign policy that, by the way, is relevant in all places and all times. It's the principle of the lesser evil. In trying to get rid of the bad guy, try to make sure you don't get the worst guy. But no one thinks that Jimmy Carter wanted Khomeini. Now, the effect of Khomeini, by the way, was to essentially, Islamic fundamentalism had been around since the 1920s when the Muslim Brotherhood was founded, but never before was it in control of a major state. So this whole business with Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the rising power of Islam, none of this all got started with Khomeini in the late 1970s. In fact, to some degree, we, and I say we meaning my generation, we were focused on the Cold War, and we sort of missed this other thing that was also important. The Cold War was very important, by the way. Don't make the mistake of thinking that because something has been defeated historically, that it didn't matter at the time. Nazism mattered at the time and threatened the whole world. Just because it's not a threat now doesn't mean it wasn't a threat then. The same is true of communism. I got by a series of accidents to Dartmouth College as an undergraduate in the early 80s. my politics was very much formed by Reagan. It was formed by Reagan because here was this extremely, somewhat bizarre, unlikely man who was in New Hampshire campaigning, the first state to have a primary. And on the face of it, it almost seemed like he was whimsical. He was not even that serious. Someone once asked him, they said, "Mr. President, we understand that you, as the governor of California, would put in a very short day at the office. You show up around 11, you leave by 4. What kind of work ethic is this?" Reagan would say, he said, "Well, you know, they tell me hard work never killed anyone, but why take the chance?" And this was Reagan. If you attacked him, he usually agreed with you. And at the same time, this unlikely man was making, I realized, it dawned on me that he was actually challenging the biggest idea of the 20th century. So what's the biggest idea of the 20th century? It's essentially the idea of collectivism. And this was manifest in communism, in the Soviet Empire, in fascism, in Germany and Italy, and then also in a kind of marching welfare state in Europe and here in America. And Reagan basically stood athwart this whole 20th century wave and challenged it. And I realized, I said, you know, he might succeed or he might fail, but this is an incredibly adventurous thing to do. It's a very brave stance to take. Now, several years later, I was in the White House. My classmate, Peter Robinson, who actually had a big hand in writing Reagan's Mr. Gorbachev, Take Down This Wall speech. I was in domestic policy, but I remember sitting in my office. We were watching Reagan. Reagan was in Berlin, giving the speech, Take Down This Wall, 1987. But none of us actually thought it was going to happen. We actually kind of admired Reagan's rhetoric and his chutzpah in going to the Berlin Wall, but 2 years later, the wall came tumbling down. And I don't even know if Reagan knew it would. This is all a way of saying that history outwits us. It's unpredictable. We can do the right thing, and that is all that we can do. The philosopher Hegel once says, the owl of Minerva flies by night. And what he means by this is that you don't know the future as it's happening. You only with hindsight can you look back and say, ah, yes, now we see that the Soviet Union was more brittle than we had thought. Now we see why they couldn't keep it going. So with the benefit of hindsight, we can see things that are not visible at the time. And that brings us to our own time and what we do now in politics and what is our situation now. To me, we're in a perilous situation because my politics is the politics of the American dream. No other country that I know of has a dream. But a dream is also an ideal. A dream is a standard, it's an aspiration. And for a lot of people, that American dream isn't really real. We as conservatives talk about ladders of opportunity, but if people don't see, if you graduate from college and you're looking for a job and you don't see an actual ladder, you're going to say, well, all the Republican Party has to offer me is rhetoric. But here's the Democratic Party and they're offering me a whole bunch of free stuff. Rhetoric, free stuff. I think I'll go with the free stuff. You'd rather have the ladder of opportunity if you can see a ladder. So all of this is a way of saying that we as conservatives rely on ladders of opportunity in order for our political program to be viable. Now, the Democratic Party. And I want to turn for a moment to the movie I made because Reagan once said something very interesting. He said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. Now, this is a way of saying that the Democratic Party is a good party. It was a good party all the way through the 19th century. It was a good party for FDR. They did some pretty good things in the 1940s with Truman. And then somehow things kind of went wrong. The Democratic Party left us. But I believe now, as I didn't believe before, but I believe now, that all of this story about the Democratic Party, and indeed much of what we read in our textbooks of American political history, is the product of what I'm going to call the progressive whitewash. The progressive whitewash is a way, and remember, this is the great advantage of controlling the professoriate. Because even if somebody else is winning on the ground politically, if you're actually writing the history books, you can make it seem like they're losing. Not because you're lying, but because you're actually controlling the way in which facts are told. It's kind of like the newspaper, or you go on a website. Every fact that you see, somebody chose to put it in there. Every picture you see, some guy decided, I'm going to use that picture and not that one. So through this principle of selectivity and interpretation, you can give meaning to things. In my last film, America, I defended America against a lot of charges. Right? America committed genocide against the Indians. America practiced slavery. America practiced segregation, Jim Crow, the Ku Klux Klan. You have this whole history of America. And somewhat naively, I was like, no, we got to remember this, we got to remember that. Now, this is not something that you want to do in politics. You don't want to be on the defensive with the other guy at your throat. In politics, you want to be at his throat. And the way to be at his throat is to realize right away that many of these bad things that the Democrats talk about did in fact happen. But here is the punchline. America didn't do them. They did. They did. Now, this seems kind of shocking, so let's back up for a moment and try to think about what we're saying. Slavery. Obviously, the Democrats didn't invent slavery. Slavery is actually one of the oldest institutions in the world. It almost predates the family. It's existed from the dawn of man. But for hundreds and thousands of years, people thought slavery was just something that was there, or they thought it was justified by necessity. In other words, there's dirty work to be done, someone's going to have to do it, so if we can capture some guy from another tribe and make him a slave, we'll make him do the work. The defense of slavery was essentially necessity. Aristotle defends slavery exactly this way. The Democrats are the first people in the world to defend and invent what is called the positive good school of slavery. The positive good school of slavery is the idea that slavery is really good, not just for the master who makes a profit off of it. It's really good for the slave. This idea did not exist before the 1820s and 30s when the Democrats came up with it. And it was their platform through the Civil War. Now again, let's look at the Civil War for a moment. The Civil War was fought between the freedom-loving North and the pro-slavery South. Really? The vast majority of people who fought on the southern side of the Civil War did not own slaves. The vast majority of people in the South didn't own slaves. Now, while it was John C. Calhoun, the southern senator from South Carolina, who invented the positive good school of slavery, the northern Democrats protected slavery. Their leader was Stephen Douglas, who did the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. So the point I'm trying to make is, again, when you look at the Civil War, this whole idea, it was the North versus the South, that's a trick. Yes, there was a North-South dimension to it, but the real slavery battle was between the anti-slavery Republican Party and the pro-slavery Democratic Party. That's what the fight was about. Now, once the Democrats lost it, they reconstructed the argument to take themselves out of it. I want to fast forward. By the way, what I'm saying is true in droves about segregation, about lynching, about the Ku Klux Klan. Not only was it a Democrat who started the Ku Klux Klan, he was a Confederate general who was a delegate to the DNC convention, but the Ku Klux Klan was the domestic terrorist arm of the Democratic Party for 30 years. It's not in your textbooks, but it is a fact. And all the grand dragons of the Ku Klux Klan through the decades were members of the Democratic Party. When Robert Byrd, who died in 2010, was eulogized by Bill Clinton, Bill Clinton had to confront the fact that this guy was was the leader of his local chapter of the Klan. And Clinton says something very interesting. He goes, he had to be in the Klan. That was the only way to get ahead in West Virginia, which is true. to get ahead in West Virginia in the Democratic Party, you had to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And all of this, like I say, is not ancient history. It bumps right up against the present. In the 1930s, young John F. Kennedy went to Germany to sort of check things out for himself, and he came back to announce that Adolf Hitler was actually a great guy. JFK said that people had misunderstood Hitler and that the people who were criticizing him were jealous of him. And if this seems like an isolated example, right about the same time FDR, another saint of the progressives, was sending members of his brain trust to Italy to study Italian fascism. Why? He thought Italian fascism was ahead of the welfare state. He wanted to bring it here. And this wasn't just a one-way admiration for Mussolini on the part of FDR. Mussolini reviewed FDR's book in an Italian magazine. He goes, "It's fantastic." He goes, "This guy's one of us. He's a fascist." Now, you may say, wow, don't really hear this kind of stuff anymore. Interestingly, we don't hear it on our own side. Why not? Because after World War II, fascism came into complete disrepute. Remember, now we associate fascism with the Holocaust, the gas chambers, but in the 1920s and 30s, fascism was seen as progressive. It involves government planning, directing capitalism by the state. Fascism was kind of cool. But the Democrats realized after World War II, can't have any of that around anymore, and so they began to basically retell the story. Fascism suddenly became a right-wing phenomenon. Trump is a fascist. Now, I say all this because as you learn, as you grow, as you go to college, you're actually encountering some very clever people who are very intelligent about the way they present politics. You actually have to become a very dangerous American to effectively advocate for conservative ideas. What the left has done, which is actually very careful, is they've taken all their crimes, slavery, segregation, forced sterilization, Jim Crow, the Klan, lynching, the forced internment of the Japanese Americans after World War II, sympathy for fascism, the whole thing. And they've taken it all and blamed it on America. America did this. America did that. No, it was actually the Democrats who did it and the Republicans who fought it. But so effective is progressive propaganda that for many years, in fact, I was kind of reluctant to identify myself openly as a Republican. If you look at all my books and letters for young conservative, I'm a conservative, but I'm not a Republican. But the truth is the Republican Party actually has a fantastic history in this country. People talk about the fight against slavery, and even today you hear conservatives who say, well, I'm standing on principle. Well, standing on principle is very good, but standing on principle actually doesn't win political battles. Who stood on principle in the 1860s? It was the abolitionists. They stood on principle. We oppose slavery. But most of their political activity, to be honest, looking back at what they did, they would do stuff like burning the Constitution. Why? Because they thought the horrible founders obviously put slavery, they allowed it, were saddled with it, they're to blame. So could the abolitionists have actually ended slavery? No. Slavery was actually ended by the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, not the abolitionists, had the power to win the 1860 election. So it's important to realize today as conservatives, we're pro-lifers, we're this, we're that, we stand on principle, yes. But no standing on principle will actually win this country back by itself. American politics is fought in teams. If you want to see your ideas implemented, you kind of have to be on the winning team. And being on the winning team is a way of making deals with people who don't share your principle in the way that you do. Movies are my latest vocation. I was a think tank guy and a speaker for many years. Why did I pivot into making films? Well, I kind of got the idea from all people from Michael Moore. Michael Moore made this movie, Fahrenheit 9/11, dropped it in the middle of the 2004 campaign, created a big stir. And so, well, part of it was I just go, well, that guy can do it. How hard can it be? But that being said, movies are a way to reach a wider audience. The thing to also remember is that movies are a way to change not only your mind, but also your heart, because movies can make you feel. When you read a book, you're thinking with your mind. When you see a play, you're essentially working with your ear, because the stage is limited. Mainly it's dialogue. When you see a movie, it's with your eyes and your ears and your mind and your heart. By the way, it is a little-known secret of movies that the fate of a movie is decisively dependent on how it does in the opening weekend. If a movie does well in the opening weekend, our movie is going to open on July 22nd nationwide. We're opening in 3 cities a week earlier, but we're opening nationwide in about 1,600 theaters, July 22nd. It's that weekend between the 2 conventions. If we do well that weekend, we'll be in 2,000 theaters the next week. If we do poorly, we'll be in 1,100 theaters. So you're going to grow or you're going to shrink. And it's funny because what this is a way of saying is that if you want to see this film, don't wait for it to come in DVD or go later. Go opening weekend. And tell your friends to go opening weekend. Why? Because that's the way to put fuel into the conservative rocket. People say, I'd like this film to be seen by independent voters who will decide the election. Well, you can help us to do that going opening weekend. And again, you're a student, so we're not asking you to give $1,000 or give $500. No, it's $10 to buy a ticket. But by targeting that time to go, you're sort of using your influence effectively as best you can. Now, here we are in a kind of a pivotal moment, I think, of American history. We've got Trump, admittedly to me, a wild card, a little bit of a wild man. That is both his strength, by the way, and his weakness. I mean, it is a strength because if I look back, Romney, Bob Dole, a whole series of candidates, George Bush the father, H.W., their great weakness, they were all decent guys. They were also heroic in a way. But this heroism was weirdly invisible. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I noticed this with Dole, with H.W. Bush. Now, those guys were military heroes. Contrast them with Reagan for a moment. Reagan was actually not a military hero. Reagan made war movies in World War II. And yet, if Reagan walked out and the Marines were lined up, they were much more excited about Reagan than they were about other guys who genuinely flew bombers in World War II and were distinguished for heroism and bravery. So what this tells you in politics is that people go, I'm looking for character. Interestingly, leadership is more about the projection of a value than necessarily about embodying that value in your own life. Romney is probably a more exemplary representative of capitalism than Trump. But Trump is actually a much better defender of capitalism and wealth than Romney. When Romney began to get pummeled by Obama for being a rich guy, he became extremely defensive. He said nothing. He actually just took an incredible, unbelievable beating from which he never recovered. Part of the appeal of Trump is that Trump actually is, not only has he not apologized about being rich, he appears to be shoving it in our faces. His political correctness knows virtually no bounds. So this is our choice. But again, with the Democrats, we're dealing with a gang. Now, in politics, we're tempted to think that this whole thing is a debate. We stand for this, they stand for that. We believe in liberty, they believe in equality. We want equality of rights, they want equality of outcomes. Don't forget that human nature isn't fundamentally motivated by debate. The reason that you do what you do, the reason that you go get a job, the reason that you live the way you do, you're driven by primal ambitions and impulses. Acquisitiveness, greed, hatred, envy, revenge. These motives of human life are not absent or exempt from politics. They are, in fact, the main motors of politics. And so when you try to understand other people, you don't just look at their ideas. You need to look at their ideas, and you need to confront their ideas. What's the big idea that the other side is putting forward in this campaign? Justice, social justice, economic justice. Now, when they put justice forward, we are tempted to play a completely different card. Freedom, liberty. But let's remember, and if you go back and read Aristotle's Politics or even his Ethics, you realize that freedom doesn't trump justice. Actually, justice is a higher principle than freedom. How do we know this? We know this because there is no such thing as good injustice. Injustice is always bad. Freedom, you can take it away if your reason for taking it away is reasonable. Not only young people and children, but adults are deprived of freedom all the time. So freedom doesn't by itself defeat justice. It's a very important principle. Part of what I'm trying to say is we have to contest the monopoly that the left claims and in fact enjoys on the issue of justice. We can't give it to them. We have to fight it. But that being said, one of the ways you fight it is you recognize that their whole claim to justice is kind of a fraud. I'll give you just one example, then I want to turn to questions. So Hillary Clinton is offering you, in one way or another, Bernie is too, a free education. A free education. It's actually pretty tempting. I didn't have money to go to college at the age of 17. I think I would have responded to free education. Now, how is it free? Education isn't actually free, any more than the Young America's Foundation can run this facility for free. Education takes rooms and technology and teachers, so it's not free. Someone has to pay. Well, who's paying? Well, the government will pay. Well, but the government is $19 trillion in debt. How do you pay? You borrow. Who do you borrow from? And this is the key point, that the debt is a baton that this generation is going to hand over to, well, in case you hadn't figured it out, your generation. You get it. Here's the baton. This money, unpaid, is now owed by you. So anybody who's offering you anything for free and is actually borrowing to get it is actually doing the following thing. They're reaching into your back pocket and taking money out of your own future earnings and giving it to you now and pretending like they're doing something, giving you something for free. It's not free. You're paying for it. So it's not the traditional liberal, I'm robbing Peter to pay Paul. They're robbing Paul to pay Paul. And they're counting on Paul to be such a sucker that he doesn't actually figure that out. And the credit goes to the person who does the thievery. Well, Hillary gave me a free college education. Did she play out of the Clinton Foundation? No. So this is all a kind of scam. The claim to justice evaporates once you begin to look at what's actually going on. I want to give you a word of advice for the future. As you go to college, as you graduate from college, you're tempted to think, I want to do something for conservatism. I want to make a difference. And one of the ways to think about this is not so much to think about who is it that I want to work for, but rather think about what is it that needs to get done, which is kind of a different question. Let me say what I mean by that. So we know that the left dominates the campus, but it's also true that the left dominates another big megaphone of our culture, which is the whole sphere of Hollywood and Broadway and the media and comedy. Think about Bill Maher, Jon Stewart, Colbert. Who do we have to go up against those guys? Well, we kind of have, nobody, and nobody. So what needs to happen? Where's our Jon Stewart? Where's our Colbert? So you think not so much in terms of where do I want to go, but what needs to be created to contest the monopoly that the left has in these powerful institutions of culture. We're just talking at dinner tonight. Someone goes, Hillary is like immune. She's Teflon. We can't get her. Now, part of that, I have to say, and we have to admire this, is the unbelievable tenacity of the Clintons. Their whole idea is no matter what comes out, we put our head down, indictment be damned, and we keep going. You have to basically knock us down and sit on us and bludgeon us while you're doing it for us to stay still. Otherwise, we're going to be moving. But the other thing is that Hillary has a secret weapon, not so secret. She has the media. The book Clinton Cash, all these exposés about Hillary. Well, it was a big story. New York Times, Washington Post, CBS News for one day. And then it all went away. Why? We can't complain about it. It's their megaphone. They're going to use it to promote their cause. You want to promote our cause? Where's our megaphone? We need to build some. We need to build some megaphones in education, in media. And the beauty of it today is you can do it with technology. 30 years ago, if you want to contest the monopoly of the campus, we'd have to start 300 campuses. If you want to fight 1-to-1. Not just fight by sending Dinesh as a speaker to campus, that's good, but I come on Wednesday, I leave on Thursday. The professors, many of these campuses, the professors are sort of like sheep that graze unmolested. And by the way, that's your mission when you go to college. Molest the sheep. You gotta... And by that I mean, I get this idea actually from William F. Buckley, where Buckley said, if you're a conservative on the liberal campus, you cannot mindlessly conserve. You actually have to figure out ways to undermine the reigning assumptions of liberal orthodoxy. It's not an easy task because you're a student. You're kind of at the mercy of the establishment, the professors, the administrators. This is where Young America's Foundation comes in. They can help you to conceive of diabolical schemes to sort of undermine what is otherwise a quite fragile political correctness that these colleges try to enforce. By the way, never get the idea that political correctness is to prevent you from saying offensive words. Nobody wants to say offensive words. Political correctness is there to prevent you from thinking ideas that fall outside the parameters of liberal orthodoxy. That's what it's there for. And that's why it needs to be uncorked and challenged. Let me end on this note. It's in American history, there have only been a few times when the future of the country really hung in the balance. Everyone says that, but it's only very rarely true. And in fact, it's only very rarely true that you even need to have this deep understanding of what America and the American founding principles are even about. It's kind of like when you live in a house. Do you need to know the blueprints of your house? No, you just lie on the couch, walk in the hallways. But it's only when your house begins to shake, then you say, oh, I better go in the attic. I better get those blueprints. I better figure out how this thing was put together in the first place. So we are at one of those moments. The Revolutionary War was one of them. The Civil War was another. World War II. And today I believe that by a different set of circumstances, by tragic necessity, the fate of America hangs in the balance, and it is going to be us, the custodians, if you will, of the American Revolution. It's up to us to think this through, not just in one election, by the way. People say, if Hillary wins, America's gone. If Hillary wins, America's not gone. But if Hillary wins, America is set back. And a juggernaut that began with Obama over 8 years. The Reagan Revolution lasted from 1980 to 2008. It was a great transformation. Even Clinton was carried by the Reagan tide. But now we are not living in the Reagan tide. We are living in their tide, which we are trying to stop. Now, in trying to stop a tide, you have to go with the weapons at hand. So after World War II, the Republican Party was in a mess. FDR had dominated American politics for 30 years. The New Deal was essentially marching unchallenged. And so the Republicans go, let's find somebody who can stop this. Eisenhower, never elected in politics before. Actually, the Supreme Commander of World War II. And Eisenhower wasn't even obviously a Republican. Who cares? If Eisenhower's the guy to stop this train, he's our man. Is Trump our guy? Who else? In politics, you have to surf on the wave. Imagine you're in California, take your surfboard. You can't surf anywhere else. You have to surf on the wave. This is the wave. And this is our moment. So I'm glad you're here. I'd be very pleased at this point to pause and answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Please say your name and school and stand up before you ask your question.
Mr. D'Souza, as you were talking about some of the lies that, Rylan Hunstead, Faith Christian in Denver, Colorado. As you were talking about some of the lies and some of the bad things that the Democrats have kind of shifted onto, other things over the centuries, I've heard some doubtful theory, that is, about how Democrats, back when we ended slavery, us Republicans, it was really the Republicans who were the bad guys, who were against all the, against abolishing slavery, and it was actually the Democrats who kind of did, spearheaded that, but then they switched party values. So it was actually the Democrats of today that ended slavery. But have you heard of this, and what do you think about that theory?
I think what you're getting at is an argument that is that can be given a label. It's called the argument of the big switch. So this is part of what I mean when I say you're up against clever opponents. And by clever opponents, think of like a lawyer, right? Lawyer goes, my client didn't do it. He was nowhere at the scene at the time. You go, oh, really? Well, here's his bloody knife. And we found it at the scene, and his fingerprints are on it, and his fingerprints are all over the victim. And then the lawyer goes, shoot. So then the lawyer goes, he actually was at the scene at the time, but he was forced to do it. He did it in self-defense. So what I'm getting at is this. The Democrats, you say, you were the defenders of slavery. And usually what they do is they say, well, yeah, but that ended in 1865. That was really a long time ago, Dinesh. Why are we bringing that stuff up now? By the way, the Democrats are the ones who always bring this stuff up. This is their thing, right? History for profit. This is what they do. So suddenly when we bring it up, can't bring it up. It's really old. Then they go, why are we talking about these antebellum things before the war? And we say, well, we're not really just talking about the antebellum crimes of the Democrats. We're talking about segregation, Jim Crow, the Klan, lynching, forced sterilization, blah, 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 going all the way to the 1960s. Then they go, oh, yeah, well, we did the civil rights movement. And then you go, no, you didn't. There was a Civil Rights Act of 1964, a Voting Rights Act of 1965, a Fair Housing Bill of 1968. More Republicans voted for all three of those things than Democrats. If the Democrats were the only party in both houses of Congress, none of those things would have passed. All the opposition to those things came from the Democratic Party. True or false? They go, true. This is all important stuff because they have totally claimed the mantle of the civil rights movement, right? And the other thing was, the racist Dixiecrats in the South all became Republicans. And so we Democrats, we may have done all this bad stuff all the way to the 60s, but then we became racially enlightened, and all the racists joined your team. So this is the argument of the big switch. I'm not going to discuss it in detail here. I will just say that this argument is, I have a book, Hillary's America, that goes with the movie. Both in the film and in the book, we take on this idea of the big switch, totally decimated. The truth of it is, there was basically one guy, Strom Thurmond, who was a racist Dixiecrat who became a Republican. By the way, when he became a Republican, he didn't defend those Dixiecrat policies. One guy. The whole Democratic argument hangs on one guy. But there were literally thousands of racist Democrats, and all of them died Democrats. So Bull Connor, the Southern sheriff who put hoses on the civil rights protest, Democrat. Orville Faubus, the governor who blocked the doors of the school and wouldn't let, I forget the name of the student, a black student, get into the school, Democrat. Eisenhower was the guy who sent federal troops. So this whole history is all there. But we don't know it that well. And that's why we allow the other side and the professors to spin it their way. Nixon had a Southern strategy. Oh, really? Well, how come he didn't win the Deep South? The Deep South was won by Wallace. Wallace was running as a Democrat. So this is a history that my point is, these days, to be an effective conservative, particularly in a college environment, you need to be equipped. You need to have these arguments razor sharp, and you need to read and learn, and then you need to articulate. If you do those things, you will become a political Dennis the Menace on the campus. And you'll be actually feared because their job has been to cover it up, and your job is simply to show things into the disinfected light of truth, which is a very joyous thing indeed to do. Okay, other questions?
Hi, Eric Schneider, Parkhurst Academy. And given the recent tragedy in Orlando and the fact that for like a week now, the Congress has been trying bills on both sides of the ideological spectrum, which have both failed quite miserably, do you think that there is a balance for gun control, at least, to strike somewhere in between trying to minimize mass killings and just murders in general, while also preserving freedoms?
I think the question is, hey, look, we understand the right to have a gun, but let's be reasonable. Now, let's remember that we have a First Amendment that protects the right to free speech. Everyone will agree that the vast majority of exercises of free speech in the world are undesirable. Most things that people say are dumb. And it would not be a bad idea just for human civilization to restrict a lot of it. But notice that free speech is protected at the absolute. One of the goals of the ACLU was to defend the Nazis marching in Skokie, right? Why? The idea is that the right is not secure if you don't protect it at the outer limit. Now, interestingly, as conservatives, we always want to be reasonable and find a middle ground. But what we need to realize here with the left is that they're not looking for a middle ground. They're looking for an opening. They're looking for a way to build one victory on top of another. And the moment you concede on one point, you have reduced your ability to defend on the next. We've seen this, by the way, with a whole bunch of social changes, and even in allowing groups to piggyback on each other that are very different. The feminist movement piggybacked on the civil rights movement, as if gender was the same thing as race. The gay rights movement is piggybacked on the feminist and the civil rights movement, even though those are different things. The history is totally different. So all I'm trying to say is let's be aware of that. Also, let's be aware that the reason for a Second Amendment is not to give people hunting privileges. The point of having a Second Amendment was simply the idea that if you have a powerful government, right, what defense do the citizens have against it? And the founders were very concerned about this. They weren't just concerned about tyranny. They were concerned about what they specifically called tyranny of the majority, which is a very creepy form of tyranny. It's the tyranny of most people in the room. So let's say you start a successful business, you make a whole bunch of money. And we have a vote. And we decide by a vote of 75-1 to come and take all your stuff. Now, that's basically what government can do. It uses the democratic process. People vote. They raise your taxes to a mere 99%. And we get to take and share all your stuff. What's your defense? You can't outvote us. What do? At some point, the founders believed that having a citizenry that is armed is going to deter us from coming up with those sorts of schemes. Not that you can necessarily defend against all of us, but we're going to think twice. So I'm not resolving a big issue, of course, and I don't mean to here. I just want you to think about why fundamental rights are put into a constitution. And by the way, the founders did limit the power of the government, the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law. Congress can't do this. Congress can't do that. So our rights are protections against the government. That's the meaning of a right. It's not like today, you have a right to health care. What does that mean? That means other guys have got to pay for your health care. That's not what the founders meant by rights. A right is a limitation on the power of the federal government against you. That's what a right is. This new concept of rights, if you think about it, it not only makes no sense, very destructive. So, other questions?
Hey, my name is Harper Thomas. I'm from Shanghai American School. So, Mr. D'Souza, first of all, thank you very much for coming out here tonight. I greatly enjoyed your speech. Secondly, as an immigrant, you are somewhat unusual in that you are also a proponent of conservative ideologies and beliefs. So why do you think the left or the Democratic Party has this monopoly, this political monopoly on immigrants from China, from Mexico, and elsewhere, and what makes you different?
I think that when we look at American history, my aspirations are almost identical with the hundreds of millions of immigrants over the centuries who have come to America. The goal has been to come to a society that is an open territory which offers nothing more than a chance to build a life. Opportunity, you might say. I call it the politics of the ladder. America is the ladder of opportunity. Yes, the government has a role. It's essentially to hold the ladder. And what does holding the ladder mean? Enforcing contracts, protecting property rights, things like that. Your job is to climb. So the Democrats have come up with a new idea. No ladders. We are on the top of the building. They are. They let down a rope. Your job is to hang on to the rope. They're going to pull you up. It's the ladder versus the rope. Now, all the old immigrants who came, the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, they all believed in the politics of the ladder. Today's immigrants are offered an alternative that was not available then. Why climb a ladder when you can hang on to a rope? And so for the first time, we now have an immigrant choice. Now, when I first came to America, I was tempted by the Democrats because they are more hospitable outwardly to immigrants. They make more of an effort. And they are more sensitive and alert to how immigrants feel and talk, and they make room for them. In fact, so they're better at this because the truth of it is, most immigrants, I teach English to completely destitute, lower middle class to poor Hispanics. If you present the ladder and the rope and put it to a vote, 90% of them will choose the ladder. Debbie and I sometimes debate this. She thinks there's more who would choose the rope, but nevertheless, a lot of them will choose the ladder. But on the other hand, if you say the Republican Party, they immediately grow blank. They grow cold. They've got all kinds of ideas of it, ideas put in their minds by our opponents. So, to me, it's a combination of the fact that a rope is in a way easier than a ladder. Hang on to the rope. You don't have to climb. We'll pull you. What the immigrants don't realize is that the goal of the people pulling the rope is not to pull you up. It's to pull you halfway and then hold. Because the moment they pull you up, you don't need them. Their goal is to suspend you in the middle of the air so that you will constantly be reaching for them. We have never said this. We don't preach this message in ghettos and barrios, which have been created by the Democrats to maintain those constituencies. That's their game. So the bottom line of it seems to me, Republicans do a terrible job at this. Republicans should be getting 90% of the Asian American vote. Most of us, in our general life, in our aspirations, even in our social values, mean, many Asian immigrants are not Christian, but they are to the right of Pat Robertson in terms of their belief in social values. Why the Republican Party is getting 35% of those people is an incredible mystery. So it seems to me this is one of those windows of opportunity for a party that has allowed itself to become way too insular and removed from the people that we can win.
Thank you very much.
Okay?
So in your speech, you talked about, what? Oh, Parker White, Carmel High. In your speech, you talked about how the combat to justice is we used freedom, but freedom doesn't work. So if we can't use freedom to combat justice, what can we use to combat it?
So the question is, you want us to argue on justice, not just on freedom. So consider the defense of the free market. Mostly the defense of the free market is, it's free. Leave me alone, right? If I am earning the fruits of my labor, you don't have the right to take those for me. Now, you can make that argument in terms of freedom. And that's free market, non-intervention, laissez-faire. That's how libertarians normally make the argument. Let's not do it that way, though. Let's make the same argument from the point of view of justice. So here we are, all of us in this room, and we are a little society. And let's assume that we each have $10. And there are in the room, let's say 100 of us. So there's $1,000 in the room. Now, your name happens to be J.K. Rowling, and so you write a Harry Potter book. And you hold it up, and you go, anybody want my Harry Potter book? It costs $2. And a whole bunch of people in this room, not all, but let's say half, go, hey, that sounds good. Here's my $2. Give me the Harry Potter book. So suddenly now we have inequality, right? You have how much? $110. $50 times 2, that's 100 plus your original 10. You have 110. But a whole bunch of people now who had $10 only have 8. You suddenly realize that out of 100 people, you are the sole member of the top 1%. Right? There's a lot of inequality. But here's the key question. Who has been wronged in terms of justice? Who has been robbed? Who has been cheated? Who has been shafted? Where's the injustice in a transaction that has produced inequality, and in fact, gaping inequality, and yet on the face of it would seem to be completely fair? Nobody was forced to give you the $2. They chose to. They would never have done it if they didn't think your book was worth more than $2. And so you have an outcome that is unequal, but not unjust. Right? So what I'm talking about is, this is like economics 101, but argued not from the point of view of freedom, but from the point of view of justice. I mean, I think you agree that if you look at your own generation, which argument is more likely to resonate with young people, an argument of freedom or an argument of what's fair? The good thing about what's fair is it's taking the other side on its own terms and beating them at their own game. That's kind of where I'm going with this. Don't give up. The American founding, even though I expressed it in terms of freedom, is also a framework of justice. That the economic allocations of capitalism are just. And that the most successful entrepreneurs receive rewards not just for meeting demand, but for anticipating demand before it even existed. That's extremely hard to do. They imagine a product before the consumer does. They make it. They take all the risk. And then they produce it. And then you voluntarily buy it. And then you find you can't live without it. And so, in that sense, they're not committing any injustice. So, that's where I'm going with that. Okay? Any more questions? Yes, go ahead.
Okay, this will be our last question.
My name is Alexander. I just graduated from Moore Park High School, and I will be attending Ole Miss next year. My question is kind of a two-part question, but I'll say them all at the same time. I hope it makes sense. Should the government still offer federal aid for college like the FAFSA, or should this be left to the states? If it is left to the states, should it be left for those out-of-state students like myself? Should it be left to the school that they are going to reside in, or should it be left to the state that they are currently a resident of?
Your question in its complexity and specificity kind of inspires me the thought that I should cut off the questions before you got started. Look, in thinking about these things, there is, I would call it, a utopian way to think about it, which is to say, if I were designing a society a la John Locke, how would I frame it from the beginning? That's one question. And that is a good way to think. It's very important to think in utopian terms because that's the standard we measure against, right? But that is also, I would argue, not all, but it tends to be something that is like a libertarian fallacy. Because in the libertarian fallacy is, I don't see why in a good society we should have stop signs. Who agreed to those? No one consented to them. The government imposed them on us. And so you see once in a while, not often, but a libertarian just uprooting stop signs, right? Not really, but part of what I'm getting at is your politics can become themselves utopian, which is to say impractical, which is to say you can never have a candidate that can win. Because you're envisioning the world as it ought to be, and you're not looking at the world as it is. So we live in a world now where the concept of states' rights took a huge beating, not just because of the Civil War, but because of the progressive ability to associate states' rights with racism and slavery. And that created a clear path for the Supreme Court to basically run amok all over states' rights and give all the rights of the states to the federal government, which can trump the states on all those rights just about at will. Short of a constitutional revolution that undoes that, states' rights is just a talking point right now. Now, that being said, education is a function for the states. True. It should be, and it should be organized in that way. The American system, the system of states, was to create what Hayek calls a framework of competing utopias. Each state tries experiments. They do all kinds of things. Some of them do crazy things. So what? It allows you to see what's working. That works over there. I don't like it. I'm going to move over here. It essentially allows within this country a diversity of social experiments and a lot of empirical testing. When you do a federal system, you don't have that. You have one shot. But again, the federal system is the one we have now, right? The federal government goes around in our world muscling not only state institutions, but private institutions. The government has tremendous control over private institutions. One of the legacies of Obama is to establish federal control over banks, insurance companies, healthcare. I mean, this is the domain of the private sector. Hillary and Bernie have correctly put their sights on education. Healthcare, 1/6 of the economy. Education, another huge sector of the economy. They're trying to colonize it all. Our goal at this point is to block them. So, I'm not answering your question in its fullest. I totally know that. In an ideal world, it would be a very important question, and we would look at, do we want to put this over here? Do we want to put this over there? What we're trying to do now is figure out a way to take this big federal monopoly, right, and puncture a hole in it. So here's how I think about it. What I think about it is not, should the FAFSA program that decides eligibility for student aid continue in its current form? That's not the right question. Here's the right question. Think of that fat and happy liberal professor who's grazing unmolested, right? How do I shake that guy up, right? How do I shake his world? Now, I can't do it right now because he's not scared of the administration because the faculty has tremendous power. He's not scared of the students. He grades them. They don't grade him. He's not scared of the parents. What can they do? He's not scared of the community. What can they do? He's basically untouched. Now, there are ways to shake that guy up. Now, let me suggest one. Imagine if someone were to be able to take, well, here's my iPhone. What if someone can build the academic iPhone? Okay, now what does that mean? You figure out a way to deliver, through technology, education of a high quality at 1/5 of the cost of going now to a state college. 1/5 of the cost. Instead of costing $40,000 a year, it costs $7,000 a year. Suddenly, just about every American family can afford it. Suddenly, the whole question of federal grants becomes sort of obsolete. You don't need a $10,000 Pell Grant. The whole thing costs $7,000. And if it's run electronically and online, you don't have to live on campus. You can if you want, but you don't have to. So what you're doing now is you're sort of rocking the whole system. Suddenly you're taking something, it's like the old rotary phone industry. The left controls the rotary phone industry. How do we penetrate the rotary phone industry? You don't. You create a new type of phone, and suddenly all those phones don't work. They're no good. Nobody wants them. That's how we fight. You actually come up, you beat them not by playing their game. You change the game completely. So you're thinking in the right way. You're thinking conceptually. You're thinking about where the federal government, the states, and that's all right, the right way to think. But also think about, in our world here and now, where we have a federal government that's doing this, what can we do here that checkmates them in this environment now? That's thinking like Reagan for today. So what we need is a Reaganism for the 21st century. And the Young America's Foundation is like a midwife. I mean, it's important to study history. But we don't live in the world of the founders. We don't live in an agrarian society. And we don't live in Reagan's world. We live in our world now. And so your job is to think through principles that are enduring, applied to a completely new situation, and that will be doing Reagan the honor that he truly deserves. Thank you very much.